Okay, I'm going to start up again. So let's talk a little bit about reincarnation. This is an important idea here. And the gist of it is you die, you go through some sort of process after death, and your Atman is essentially recycled. And it's a recycling process. There's Vaishnava, the memory wiping, and then you are reborn, and then you go through this thing. And during this time, when you're from birth to death, you accumulate karma. You have certain kinds of karma, and then that leads you to your next rebirth. So the kind of karma you get in your lifetime will inform what your situation will be in the next cycle, next reincarnation. In other words, you do bad things this whole life, you get into bad habits, and when you're reborn, you're more likely to be born in a more negative condition. Okay? And you could obviously be reborn as a human being or as an animal or something else, depending on what your karma is. Okay? So they always say, you're going out and killing chickens all day. Maybe the cosmic irony is that you're reborn as a chicken, right? There's not an exact algebra of this, at least not that I've been able to ascertain from anybody, because there's lots of things. Every little thing we do is a kind of a karma, and this affects, again, your rebirth. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, this memory wiping thing doesn't always go perfectly. And this has come to the attention of people, of some scientists who are studying this kind of thing. And I will make the claim that out of all the kind of conceptions of an afterlife, of what happens to you after you die, reincarnation is the only one where there is some systematized scientific evidence for. People have actually studied this. They've actually found people whose memory loss was not didn't work real well, and then been able to go and talk to these people, and they have very accurate memories of their past lives. The memory loss may not work really well when the death is very sudden and very violent. That seems to be a kind of a common theme that occurs. So I have some video of this. Let me show you. Oh, but we don't have any damn sound. I'm not going to be able to show you this. Darn it. I guess I'll just tell you about it. Oh, it sucks.
Is there are there some controls on that computer?
No, I don't want to mess around with it.
You can turn on the closed captioning.
Yeah, I can do that. Not quite the same though. This is just a talk. So this is, what I'll do is I'll try to put this lecture up in the PowerPoint form so all the links are in it, instead of a PDF form so you guys can listen to this yourself. This is a guy talking about studies done by another guy named Dr. Ian Stevenson. This is Ian Stevenson here. And this is also another good thing to watch. So he was at the University of Virginia, and he did a lot of research on children who remember previous lives. And what he did is he would go to places like India where people believe in reincarnation, and he would find these extraordinary cases of these kids who would remember their past life in detail. And what he did is, he'd take these kids, he'd go and interview them, they would describe a place, he would try to figure out where this place was, he would take the kids back to the place, sometimes it was really far away, back to the place, and the kid would go, yeah, that was my house over there, my Uncle Billy lived over there, and my bike was on the corner over there, and my mom's name is Carol, and my dad's name is Ken, and my brother Ann, or sister Ann, and a brother John, and we hung out in this place, and we did these kind of things. And the last thing I remember was one day I was riding my bike, and then that's it, And then another interesting thing is a lot of these kids would have interesting birthmarks. So one kid was riding his bike and like something hit him in the neck and knocked his head off or something, and he had a birthmark like on his neck, like here, right? And so this was very interesting. It's a very interesting phenomenon that would occur. And Stevenson documented, I think it was about 2,500 of these cases, and was very meticulous about how he collected evidence for these things to try to rule out, like, oh, these kids just made this stuff up, or that, you know, they were fed information by adults. He really was able to rule this out, and he was able to actually go physically and have these kids identify stuff from their past lives. It is very, very convincing that in some way, shape, or form, these kids somehow got some memory of a past life. Now, does that prove reincarnation? Absolutely not. And Stevenson was the first one to say that. It does not prove anything about reincarnation. All it does is say there's a phenomenon going on here that we do not understand. Could be that reincarnation is true and that there's a soul that migrates. It could be somehow these memories get transferred. We don't really know. But the best explanation we have right now is that reincarnation is something. And if you're going to believe in some sort of afterlife, this is the only one where there is really this systematized body of evidence pointing toward, at least in some cases, this going on. Okay, does that mean it's also universal for everyone? We have no way of knowing. And again, Stevenson, up until Stevenson died a few years ago, up until his death, he was adamant about this. This is not proving anything. It's just uncovering a thing that we don't know about yet. We don't know why this occurs. But he had a lot of cases of this. And he wrote a book where he took 120 of these cases, the most compelling ones, and he put these into a book. I have it up in my office. Anybody ever wants to take a look at it? It's really quite interesting. Really, really quite interesting that something is going on here. And again, a lot of these people had these sort of violent deaths, these sort of things. Now, the criticism of Stevenson's work is that when you look at his cases, most of these cases occur in a place where they have a belief in reincarnation. And that he's been criticized for that. I don't know how it means anything. My guess is that in places where you don't believe in reincarnation, when kids have this phenomenon, that their stories aren't taken very seriously. And so you don't see a lot of this in the Western world, for instance, because the stories aren't taken very seriously. There is some exceptions to that, and one of the most interesting ones is there's this kid here. This is Stevenson's book, by the way. And there's a kid here who is was born, and his father was actually a fundamentalist Christian, really hardcore Christian fundamentalist. And so initially, a lot of the kids' stuff was ignored, but the kids' recollections were so precise that the parents really, even though their religion said this isn't a real thing, really started having to pay attention to it. This kid, they took him to an air show, and he walked up to a airplane, and he started to do all the pre-flight checks of the plane, looking at the gas cap, looking at the flaps under the plane, these kind of things. There's a video of that too. I'm bummed that this thing isn't working. It's bumming me out, but I have some video of that too. Where is it? Well, I'll try to get this thing working. Maybe next time we can do it. Anyway, I'll just tell you about it. So, like things like this, and the kid would have these horrible nightmares. Would wake him up every night, and in the nightmares, they're always the same. He's flying a plane. He took off from an aircraft carrier. He's flying a plane. He's fighting the Japanese. He's shooting, and eventually his plane gets shot, and he goes down, and he doesn't remember. He has the same nightmare over and over and over every night. He's able to name the aircraft carrier that he was on by name. He's able to talk about, he's saying his name is James, and he's James the Third. the third in the line. He's able to give the name of his friend, his best friend, who was also a pilot. He's able to say he saw a picture of Iwo Jima, and he said, that's where I got shot down. He remembered these very exact details about what went on. So they looked up, they found out, sure enough, there was a pilot named James, who was James III. The name of his friend was also another pilot on the boat. The name of the aircraft carrier was accurate. It was in this battle. And supposedly in this battle, this James guy got killed. And this kid remembered all this stuff. And so they wrote a book about it, and get this, Sole Survivor. And really quite compelling case of reincarnation. And very interesting because he's reincarnated 50 years after the fact. And again, this goes to this Hindu idea that time is not, it's not quite so linear. It's not like you die and then immediately you get reincarnated again. That sometimes there's a delay. You don't get reincarnated right away. When we talk about Tibetan Buddhism, we'll talk about the length of time, because there is sort of an average time that Tibetans have come up with, how long it takes, but it's not always the case. In this case, it was 50 years. So again, this is a very interesting phenomenon. We don't have any way to explain this, in Western science. There's no explanation for this, but it's something we're definitely able to observe in an objective way in a number of cases. Okay, so again, this should give you some thoughts. If you're thinking about a doctoral dissertation, this would be an interesting area to look into. Yes?
What about the growing population?
The what?
How is that explained? Growing population, how is that explained with reincarnation?
Well, that's very easy because, one way to explain it is that, that other beings are being upgraded to humans. So maybe you were a dog in the last life, but you were a really good dog, and so you got a lot of good karma, and so now you upgraded to a human being. And then also got to realize that some human beings are going off the wheel, right? Some people are getting enlightenment, getting off. You don't hear much about them, but presumably some of them are out there. They've resolved all their karmas and they're going off. So yes. So again, there is supposedly inputs into the system and outputs into the system. But again, we're seeing within the system this phenomenon of reincarnation. And again, we don't have an explanation for this. We don't have a good scientific explanation for this. But this is how, by the way, science proceeds. When there's an anomaly in things, this is where, and you can't explain it, this is where you get your scientific questions from. Right? How do you explain this? Some of you may or may not know that the Christian Church, which back in the day was only the Catholic Church, believed in reincarnation up until about 1000 AD. That was part of the church doctrine, early Christian doctrine. And then at that time, around 1000 AD, they dropped it. Okay, so again, this was something not unknown to early Christians, early people in Western religions. And this was not an alien doctrine until later. Okay. But again, we see things like this, and again, we don't have a good way to explain it. Yes, you have a question?
Could you reincarnate, not backwards, but could you...
Technically, my understanding is that you can reincarnate anytime. You don't necessarily reincarnate into the future. You could reincarnate into the back, you could reincarnate sideways, technically. But what I'm going to say is, and this may be a little tinged by my knowledge of Buddhism, that the habit is to go forward. And so technically, I think you find most people, when you talk about reincarnation, they're reincarnating into the future, what we perceive as the future. Yeah, but I believe technically that's not an absolute requirement. You could technically reincarnate into the past.
Could I be you?
You could not be me. Because in Hinduism, you could not be me. Because in Hinduism, you are an individual Atman that is migrating around, going around and around and around. So technically, we don't reincarnate into each other. No. Buddhism, things are going to mix up a little bit. Okay? You wouldn't be completely me, but there is no me and there is no you in Buddhism. So that's to give that away. We'll talk about that later. Okay? So very interesting idea. And here pictures, the kid would draw pictures. So this is the pictures of him fighting and things going on. But James III, because he was the third. Spontaneously put that on there. And that's a picture of him when he was an Army officer there, or an Air Force guy. So, how do we get off the wheel then? How do we work to resolve our karmas and get off the wheel? And again, this is the average. These are the typical ways that Hindus do these things. And you can do all or one or a few, just depends, okay? First one is meditation, which would include now what we call the practice of yoga, but also not the practice of the yoga that we do in the West, because we've how can I say this? We've, for the most part, de-Hinduized our yoga practice. Okay, and again, if you see people practicing more traditional yoga in India and places like that, there's usually more of an aspect of meditation to it. There's some yoga that's just purely meditational. And these postures and everything here are supposed to, help you to get in a sort of meditative place. But you can do these meditations, yoga. The meditation can seem a lot like other kinds of meditation you've heard of. And again, if we had some video here, I could show you these things. Here's a person talking about meditation. So I'll try to put these links up after I yell at the people in the IT department for not fixing the computer. And I was going to play you some wonderful music too. I'm bummed out about this. So meditation, yoga. The other one is ritual communion or satsang. Those of you who are Christians, this will be similar to going to church on Sunday and hearing a sermon. Okay, you actually have a guru who gives you some sort of teachings or makes some sort of commentary, usually to a group of people. It's usually a group of people getting together and ritually talking about the religious practices. The third one is worship, or known in Sanskrit as puja. And this is a sort of a ritual where you actually are showing worship, usually to a deity of some type. And you can do this in a temple. And I have a really wonderful video here of, let's see which one I have there. Do I have the rat temple? No. Oh yeah, I have the snake puja here. Well, you don't need sound for this one. Even though there's lots of sound going on. You see what they're doing. This is a typical puja here. Let's get to the good part. Where is it? Here we go. So there you go. You see the large cobra here. He's really quite large. And they are doing a ritual offering to the cobra as a representation of a deity. He's a pretty big snake. And this guy's holding him here. You can't see him on the other side. His head's over here, but this is his arm. He's holding the snake here. And they're doing a ritual offering to this guy. And there's people gathered around, and this is the religious ceremony. This is the puja. Okay. Now, this is not a typical Hindu temple. So you don't need to worry when you go to the Malibu temple that there's snakes like this running around. Okay? So just put that out there. This is a little atypical, but I thought I would show it to you because it's interesting. Okay. And there's kids around, and there's families, and they're all participating in this. This guy's the Brahmin priest here. This is his job. Praying, doing offerings, chanting mantras. That is one huge snake. A fire offering. That's probably the safest he felt during this whole ritual. We get the idea here.
Are the snakes sometimes not cooperative?
I don't know. I assume. We have religious snake handlers in the United States. You guys know about them, right?
Yes.
If you don't know about them, I am teaching the bizarre behavior class next semester, and I sometimes have Dr. Baker come and he gives a lecture on religious snake handling in America, which is really quite fascinating, which is a little different than this. But again, there's also some similarities here. We'll talk about that. But anyway, that's a kind of a puja. Usually they're not that dramatic. They're just a ritual. And I might have some other video here. Let's see if there's something here I can show you that doesn't require sound. So here's a woman, and what she's doing is talking about doing puja in the home. So home puja, you can have a little altar in your house, and these are pictures of deities, and you do some offerings to these deities, you may do some mantras and things like that. And a lot of Hindu people will have a temple in the house, a little part of the house that's set aside for these purposes, and they'll perform puja on a regular basis. Usually a daily basis you perform puja, do your offerings. Okay? So she's describing it very nicely. Unfortunately, we can't hear it. And then you have renunciation. And this is in Sanskrit called sunnyasan. And for most people, traditional Hindus, this is usually later in life. And traditionally what would happen is that there's stages of life in Hindu. You know, you're growing up and you grow up, you get married, you're a householder, and then once you've had your career and your kids are all grown off, typically the male would go off into the woods and become a renunciate and devote their life to religion. And of course the women would be somewhat abandoned. That's changed a little bit now that women can do this as well. And you would go off in the woods and you would be renounce life. The years that you had left in life you would spend devoted to religion, and that can be living in the woods by yourself, or that could be you're just going to devote your time to doing religious, spiritual activities. And so usually later in life. Not always later in life. You can also do this when you're younger, and you can become a sadhu. I'm going to talk about sadhus a little bit later on, and you can have all sorts of different practices. If you're called to become basically a monk or a nun or some kind of spiritual practitioner, you can do that earlier in life. That's not typical of everybody, but some people do that. And the last one is devotion. And devotion is often shown by doing what's called bhakti. Bhakti is devotion, and bhakti can be done in a number of ways. And again, it can be you're going to temples, you're doing things, you're going on religious pilgrimages, you are singing. You're singing the Word of God. I don't know if anybody here is into yoga, but sometimes the yoga studios have something they call kirtan, which is where you're chanting mantras in musical form. Everybody does this together. That's sort of an act of devotion or bhakti. Bhakti can also be devotion to a guru who represents the deity. It can also be devoted to the deity itself, and it could be temple worship. It could be all sorts of different things. Okay, but bhakti is devotion, showing some sort of devotion. It could be doing works, helping poor people on behalf of a deity. Lots of different things, lots of forms of bhakti. Okay? So this is also known. So these things are the typical ways that, as a Hindu, would try to reduce karma to sort of hasten getting off the cycle and into moksha. Now, 5 obligations of all Hindus. Again, these are the average. Not all Hindus have these obligations or follow these, but most, or at least the average. This is what you find. First is worship, upasana. This can be daily worship, puja in the shrine room, going to rituals, chanting, yoga, whatever way you do it. You can be wearing traditional dress. A number of ways you might do this. Holy days, utsava, participating in Hindu festivals and holy days. And if you go to India, you will definitely come across Hindu festivals, holy day festivals. They're all happening all the time in India. People really like to have celebrations. They have parades, they have floats, they have all sorts of stuff going on. They're really fun. A lot of times these are accompanied by really, really great food. Sometimes it's fasting, going to the temple, and then, when the fast is over, you offer all the food to the gods, and then when the fast is over, you eat all the food. Really, it can be fantastic. If you go to India, you'll see some of this. Virtuous living, dharma, living by living in a good way. This is a life that dharma is the duty and conduct that you want to have as a Hindu. So you have obedience to your parents, respectful of your parents, thinking of others first, being selfless, being nice, taking care of your teachers, following the rules, whatever rules they have, especially ahimsa, and this can help you resolve all karmas. Pilgrimage, going on pilgrimages. You try to do this once a year. You try to go to holy places, and you might have what they call darshan or darshana of the temples or the places. Darshan is basically the coming into contact with. To use a Western psychological term, we would say phenomenological intentionality. That you have a contact, you have a very deep contact with the god or with the guru, And this can be either, they're staring at you, or this can be maybe you wash their feet. There's a number of ways you can have this darshan. If you go to the Malibu Hindu temple, in the main temple upstairs, and you look and there's a statue of Vishnu in the back, and you'll see over the eyes of the statue is blinders. That's there for your benefit, because if you go there and stare into the eyes and have this direct contact with God through the statue, that it can burn out your circuits, it can overwhelm you. And so you have to be prepared to do that. And again, the priests have the preparation for that, but the lay people, especially if they're non-Hindus, might not. And so they put those over there to protect people, because the darshan would overwhelm you. Okay. So this is important. Also going, putting aside time in your life for spiritual activities, to go into these places, to go to pay attention to the guru, to get teachings from your guru, these kind of things. And the last one are rites of passage, and these are observing the typical sort of milestones in life. Okay, this might be birth, a name giving, head shaving, first feeding, ear piercing, first learning, coming of age, marriage, and death. Hindu marriage ceremonies are really quite elaborate, for instance. They usually last about 3 days. And there's lots of people involved, and people dress up, and they're a big deal. Typical Hindu wedding here. You can see this is the part that you guys may recognize, the father getting rid of the bride. But then there's other parts that may include white elephants riding and all sorts of things. There's obviously food and things. This is more of a modern one, but you can see the idea here. And then, of course, we have death, rites of passage. And Hindu rites of passage are very interesting. Typically, the ideal is that if you can afford it, your body will be cremated in a ceremony, preferably along the banks of the holy Ganges River, which runs through northern India. And then once your body is cremated, the ashes will then be dumped in the river. And even if an ash or a piece of bone, supposedly from your body, goes into the Ganges, you will be guaranteed a good rebirth. Okay, so people like to use the Ganges. But it can also just be a cremation. It could also be another river. If you're in Nepal, you may be dumped into another river. But these are these funeral ceremonies, and these are quite interesting. You see the guy bringing the wood here. Now, again, you have to have the money to pay for this wood, because it's not cheap. And you'll see there's also a lot of pollution in the Ganges, so this is a problem. But they found the Ganges has a low level of radiation. There's enough uranium washing down from the mountains. There's a low level of radiation. I think maybe that kills off some of the germs and things. But unfortunately, it is very polluted. But here you go. You see them preparing the body. The body's there. They'll put wood on top. They'll dip it in ghee. Ghee is clarified butter. That makes the fire burn hotter. They'll cremate the body. And once the body's cremated, they'll dump the ashes in the river. And all the time there's a religious ceremony going here. People are chanting mantras. Body burns down, the ashes are left. I don't know why they put a picture of them rowing. They usually don't row the ashes out, they just sort of scoop, they're on the side of the river, they just scoop them down the river. They're preparing the dead person. There's, see the funeral pyre being lit here. There you go. The bone of the person should touch the water, person shall dwell honored in heaven. That's in the Mahabharata. Anyway, you get the idea here. That's a Western translation, by the way. And you're going to go to heaven. More likely, it really means you're going to get a good reincarnation. Okay. 5 obligations. Vedas and Dharma. So the Vedas are sacred texts that are revealed to enlightened sages. The texts are originally oral traditions, or you may have written texts that are written down, but key words or key concepts are left out. And so you need the oral transmission to unlock the meaning of the text. This is very common in many traditions of Asian thought. We'll find this also in for instance, in China. This is very typical. Those of you guys taking the 436 class, the martial arts class, this is very typical for martial arts text. The teacher would write down the martial arts stuff, the techniques, the secrets, but he would leave out something that only could be transmitted to you orally. So this is also, you find this, that they need to be unlocked by the oral instructions. These Vedas are thought to be divinely inspired but created by human beings. Okay, so they're not the literal word of God. They're mostly written in Sanskrit, the ancient language of India. There's a few written in Tamil. Vedas, the word Veda literally means knowledge. It's from the Sanskrit root vid, and vid means to know, and it's the same. This comes us to in Latin, and comes from Latin into words like video, as is to know from a vision. Right? This is literally what video means, to know from a vision. These Vedas were composed between 1500 and 900 BCE. So we know the Vedas are not as old as what the practices that we call Hinduism are. We know that Hinduism is actually a lot older than this, but this is when we start getting the written stuff. There are 4 Vedas. The Rig Veda is the oldest. It consists of 1,028 sacred hymns to accompany sacrifices to the many gods. There's the Sama Veda, verses arranged for ritual purposes, how to do these rituals. The Yajur Veda, sacrifice formula, how to do the sacrifices. The Atharva Veda, which are magical spells. And there are additional Vedic scriptures as well, called the Brahmanas. And these are theological treatises dealing with details and symbolic significance of the Vedic rituals. So a lot of early Hinduism was all about doing these rituals and sacrifices. And it's thought, again, you do these kind of things. And again, in a way here, you can see the shamanic roots of Hinduism. And we're going to talk a lot about shamanism when we get to Taoism. But again, one of the things about shamanism is where you have these sort of rituals that you do, usually to satisfy there's some sort of god or some sort of entity, and the priest's job is to do some sort of to figure out what, how do you appease that god. Maybe it's pissed off at you, maybe it ruined the crops, it hailed down and destroyed all your crops. And so the priest would then go, sometimes go into a trance, commune with that god, find out what's going on, and then say, we need to sacrifice. We need a goat sacrifice, or we need to give it certain offerings, and then things will be okay. Right? And this is sort of the job of the shaman. Okay? And again, we see the roots of that in Hinduism as well as many, almost all other religions have some shamanic roots to it. And I'm going to go in detail about this at the end of the semester when we talk about Taoism, because Taoism has a very clear shamanic background. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But again, these Vedas may be some of the systematizing, or writing down of some of these shamanic rituals that form the precursors to what we now call Hinduism. Now, each of the Vedas itself has a supplemental text. In some way, these supplemental texts may be more important than the actual Vedas. These supplemental texts actually may be more relevant to what people do in Hinduism. So there's a couple supplemental texts. The Brahmanas I mentioned, these give the detailed explanation and rules for the ritual. And the Brahmanas are attached to different Vedas and are relevant to the different function and role of a Brahmin priest. So if you become a Brahmin priest, you're born into the Brahmin priest caste, you probably learn these pretty well, because this is basically an outline of your job. Then there's the Aranyakas, the forest books of esoteric learning, which form a bridge from ritualism to meditative practice. So at some point in Hinduism, what happens is that people say, these rituals have become sort of empty, and they're really not doing it, they're not really connecting individual people to sort of this mystical reality. So what happens is there's sort of a bridge that happens, take the rituals more toward a meditative practice so people can have a direct experience of this sort of supreme reality. And this sort of stuff is written in these books. Then we have the most famous, I think, of the texts that we typically know from Hinduism is the Upanishads. And these are speculative philosophical texts. Okay? And these were written, these supplements to the Veda were composed later, probably around 700 to 300 before the Common Era. We also have other things that are less technical, the Puranas. These are literally means tales of the old days, and these are popular stories about the gods and their origins and people and epic heroes. These date from even later, from about 300 to 1000 in the Common Era, and these are kind of very mythological. And they also contain moral codes and laws, dharma, conducts of behavior, and includes a legitimization of the hierarchical social order. This is the so-called caste system in India. Okay? And the caste system in Sanskrit is called Varna. And there's a bunch of different castes. The main ones at the top are the Brahmins, the priests, the Kshatriyas, the warriors, rulers, the Vaishya, which are the merchants, the Shudras, the farmers, the craftsmen, manual laborers, and later on, you go down the list, you get down to the Harijans, the outsiders or the untouchables, who are at the bottoms. Okay? Now, this caste system has been criticized quite a bit because what this does is it perpetuates a certain social hierarchy. In other words, if you're born as a Brahmin, then guess what? You're going to have certain things. You're going to be expected to be learn certain things, to do certain things, but you're also going to be at the top of the order. Okay? If you're born at the bottom of the order, you're an untouchable. Meaning the only job you're going to get is being a street sweeper. But you want to go to medical school. That's going to be closed to you because you're born into this caste. So you obviously did enough bad things in the past lives that your karma was you got born into this low caste. And that's your fate, and so you just have to accept it and stay there as a street sweeper. You don't get to have any upward mobility. You don't get to go and move up. Right? And if you can imagine this, you can think about this from a postmodern point of view. This allows the people with the power to remain in power, and it keeps the people without power kept down, right? And so this system in modern times has been criticized, and the Indian government has outlawed this caste system and is now trying to get rid of it. And that's very easier said than done because this is traditional. It's been around for a couple thousand years, but it obviously carries with it a lot of prejudice and racism. Okay, it's very interesting that people at the bottom of the caste system tend to be darker. One thing I didn't mention when I talked about the sort of origins of India, that India was basically originally settled by people called the Dravidians, who tend to be shorter and darker and tend to worship earth gods and goddesses. And they were intermixed. What happened, it used to be that people thought India and subcontinent was then invaded by people who were called what? Aryans, right? It's not the German Nazi Aryans. These are Aryans who came from the northern part, probably somewhere Iraq, Iran area, but they come in and they are taller, fairer people who worship sky gods. And then what happens is, the original thought was that these Aryans came down and conquered the Dravidians, and then they mixed together, the populations mixed, and that's where the modern Indian population comes from. Newer scholarship suggests that there was not a conquering of the Dravidians by the Aryans, but there was an intermixture. That the Aryans migrated in and there was more intermixture than there was conquering going on. But as a result, you have lots of different people in India, you have lots of different types, and some people are darker than others, other people are lighter. The predominant gods, many of these gods that we're going to talk about, in essence, are sky gods. They come from the sky, they live up in heaven, they live up in some place, there's some exalted place. And the more earth gods, the chthonic gods, chthonic, that's a nice word, means comes from the earth, are sort of mixed in. Okay, but but again, this feeds into this idea of this caste system. That again, the lower caste people tend to be darker, and the higher caste system tend to be lighter. Okay, the Brahmins who are at the top of it tend to worship more sky gods, and darker people, more Dravidian people, tend to be worshiping more of the earth gods. But of course, in modern Hinduism, the earth gods and sky gods are a little bit more mixed together. So, Indian government, I think quite rightly so, from my American standpoint, has been trying to work to get rid of this, has outlawed the caste system, has been working to get rid of it. And there's all sorts of programs. If you're born into a low caste, and you want to go to medical school, they have lots of equal opportunity programs to try to get people into jobs and into education so that we don't have to have this stuff anymore. But again, this caste system comes from these original works. Okay? It comes from and is derived from these original works. Okay? Now, some scholars say that a belief in the Vedas is one of the things that's necessary to consider yourself to be Hindu. Okay? And for these people, for instance, Buddhism, which is a spin-off religion, is no longer thought of as a branch of Hinduism because Buddhism rejects the authority of the Vedas. Okay? On the other hand, because Hinduism is really broad and diverse, some Hindus disagree with this. And they say, no, that's not true. Buddha was just like a Hindu sage. He's fine. He's the incarnation of Vishnu. So sure, you can worship the Buddha. It doesn't matter. So again, there's a little bit of, it's not everybody believes the same thing. Now, dharma, which are the rules, religious rules of conduct, is revealed by the Vedas. And dharma, the idea of dharma is something that's very close to the idea of religion in the West. And includes things like duty, truth, ethics, law, natural law, things like that. Okay? Now, in Hinduism, dharma is more related to behavior than beliefs. This is a little different than Western religions, like in Christianity, right? So in Christianity, if you're Catholic, what do? You might go out and you might have do some sinful things, but you have the belief that if you go and pray, that God will, forgive you of your sins. And so what do? You go, if you're Catholic, you go to the confessional and you confess to the priest, and he says, do 10 Hail Marys and you'll be okay, right? So really, belief is to some degree more important than behavior. It's not to say that behavior is not important for Christians or other people in the West, but it tends to be, the belief is the primary thing. Am I right, Christians? Is that the main thing? My understanding of Christianity, if you want to be a Christian, you have to believe in the Holy Trinity, and you have to believe that Jesus died for your sins and was resurrected. Is that basically it? Am I close? I'm seeing head nodding. So most of you Christians, because Christians also, by the way, have some diversity among the way they believe things, right? But that's more or less a kind of a core belief system. So the belief is really central to this, right? I may be a bad person. I may have gone and done things. I may have robbed and killed people. But I went to prison, and when I was in prison, I found Jesus, and now I believe in Christianity, and Jesus now is going to forgive me for my sins, and I'm good to go. Doesn't mean I can go out and start doing bad things, but belief is central. Belief sort of trumps the behavior, right? Hinduism, that's not really quite the same. Okay? Man or woman is judged by their actions. Okay? And this, again, is why being a theist, pantheist, atheist, communist, existentialist, etc., makes little difference. Your beliefs in Hinduism, what you believe in religiously, doesn't really mean that much. What really makes you a Hindu is what you actually do behavior-wise. And that can include practice rituals and adhering to, the dharma, right? Non-injury to beings, caring for other people, respecting your teachers, things like that. Being a good person, not cheating, not stealing, all those kind of things. Okay, that's more important than the belief system. Now, what you can and can't do, however, your behavior is determined, traditionally was determined by your caste. And also, not only your caste, but also, unfortunately, your gender, traditionally. That women had certain, things they could do and couldn't do. And there are lots of ideas of purity and pollution come into play here. You're a lower caste member, you're impure. You sweep the streets all day, you're impure. And so that's why you would not see a Brahmin, for instance, going and, going out in the park and picking up dog poo, right? Because that's impure. That's not appropriate for their caste. There's people to do that, right? And this, again, behavior reflects the power structures which take precedent over the beliefs. Okay, so the power structure, again, traditionally, I'm not going to be too critical of Hinduism, but I mean, because you have this in other religions as well, but power structure is coming into play here, right? I'm on the top of the heap, I'm a Brahmin, I don't pick up crap in the park, right? You're untouchable, you were born there, that's your job, and you're going to stick with that. That's what you get to do, right? In our modern way of thinking, this is really unacceptable. Okay? And this is also true in modern India. This has now become unacceptable, at least in the rule. I'd like to tell you, like in America, that, I'd like to say we're Americans, we're not racist anymore, we're done with racism. Officially, if you look, we have equal opportunity here, we all are, the same kind of citizens, all those kind of things, but we still have lots of racism in America. I think probably most of you guys hopefully would agree with that, because if you don't agree with it, then you think it's gone, and you're not going to do anything to get rid of it. The same thing with the caste system in India. Okay? I think most people think it's not a good idea, but of course, this is a really strong tradition, and so the remnants of it remain. And even though, being racist in the form of the caste system is against the law, it still plays out in more subtle ways. So again, they have, the United States isn't the only racist place where officially racism is banished, but unofficially people still unfortunately practice it. And you still find that in India as well, in the form of this caste system. Okay, questions so far on this stuff? I'm going a little fast because I didn't have time to play these videos, so I'm going to hopefully next time maybe show you some of the videos of these things. Just making sense? I have to tell you that of all the things I talk about in this class, for me, Hinduism has been the hardest one for me to get a hold of because it is so unstructured, and it is the religion system of thought that for me is really hard to get my mind around. It really takes a little bit. It's really pretty vast. There's contradictions to everything I've said. You can find an example of a contradiction to. I mentioned like stories of the origins of the gods, origins of the universe, origins of time. If you look in Hindu myths and stories, you will find alternate versions of those. There are plenty of these out there. And they're all good. There's no one that's supposedly better than the other. They're all good. And they're all valid. Okay? And again, I want to reiterate that these things I'm telling you, these are the general ideas. Okay? The general ideas, the average. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Hindu gods and goddesses. In some ways, perhaps I should have talked about these first. But I think I want to give you a little more background about sort of the practices and the beliefs, and then we'll talk about the gods or goddesses. So again, this is, we're taking the average here. So for most Hindus, these are the major gods and goddesses. For most, but not all. Okay? These are the major gods and goddesses. And there is a Hindu trinity. And this Hindu trinity consists of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. These are the three main dudes, guys, right? And each of these guys has their consort. Brahma's consort is Saraswati. Vishnu's is Lakshmi, and Shiva's is Parvati. Parvati takes on two wrathful forms, Durga and Kali. Anybody here Irish? Any Irish people, any Irish background? Some Irish. Anybody here named Kelly? You know the name Kelly? It's a good Irish name.
That was my birthday before I was adopted.
Kelly. Some people believe that Kelly is actually a derivation of Kali, and that the worship of Kali, worship of the goddess, came out of India and worked its way all the way up to Europe, all the way up into Ireland, where if you look at the old Celtic rituals, you will find some remnants of Kali worship. And they think that the name Kelly is actually derived from Kali. I don't know if that's true or not, but I read that somewhere. I thought that was really interesting. So who knows? We'll talk about Kali a little bit more in detail. Kali, the name means dark. She's dark. I'll talk about that in a second. Now, Shiva and Parvati have two sons. The birth order of these depends on what you read. Sometimes one comes first, sometimes the other one comes first. The one son is Kartikeya, and Kartikeya is the god of war. A little like, how Ares was in Roman mythology. But he is not, you don't see much worship of him. You don't talk about him very much. Kartikeya is not much, not popular. Okay? The other son, however, is Ganesh. And Ganesh is the elephant-headed god. And he is super popular. As popular, I would say, as these other three. So in a way, he's really the fourth one here. Ganesh, worship of Ganesh is really popular. Ganesh is the god of knowledge and the remover of obstacles. So you got something on in your life, something's just not happening for you, there's some obstacle to whatever it is. Ganesh is the go-to guy. Lesser known is Ganesha is also the, he will also put obstacles in your way if you are not behaving properly. You know, you're going out tonight to make a drug deal and it doesn't go very well. Ganesha has stepped in and put some obstacles in there because that's not a good thing for you to be doing. Okay? So he's really popular. Ganesh is really popular. And I'll talk a little bit about him. I like to go a little detail because Ganesha's story is great. Because remember I talked in the beginning of class about Freud? And you were probably thinking to yourself, how come this crazy professor has to bring Freud into every single one of his classes? Besides the fact that he knows Harley Baker, who also does the same thing. No, none of my other professors here talk about Freud. Why would you talk about Freud? Especially a class on Asian religions. Why would we talk about Freud? Well, remember I talked to you about Freud. Remember one of the central things in Freudian psychology, the theme? Remember this? What is it? Complex? What kind of complex? Oedipal complex, right? Ganesha's story is almost pure Oedipal complex. If Freud had never heard the Greek myth of Oedipus, but instead had studied Hinduism, and he studied about the origins of Ganesh, he could have come up with the same system of psychology. Because Ganesha's story is very much an Oedipal complex, and Ganesh is a god who has the head of an elephant, which, if you're a Freudian, looks mighty phallic. So he's great. He's really, as a psychologist, I just love Ganesha. Ganesha is one of my favorites. I'll talk to you a little bit about him. But let's start out talking about Brahma. Brahma is this guy, no, wait a minute, I want to talk about, I have these slides out of order. Okay, let's talk about Brahma a little bit. Slides. Oh, well, look, I'm not going to get to either part the next time because I have the wrong set of slides. All right, we'll get to these later. Okay, so Brahma. I'll talk a little about Brahma. Brahma is this multiple-headed god. Usually he has 4 heads. Brahma is very interesting. Brahma is the creator god. He creates our existence. And again, I told you the story. Vishnu is lying down, taking a nap, and Brahma rises from his navel on a lotus, and then Brahma opens his eyes and the universe comes into being. Okay? And so he's the creator god. Creator god. He is not much worshipped anymore. Very interesting. I think in all of India, India's got like, a billion plus people. I think in all of India, and there's just, every little town has a temple in India. There's temples everywhere. Hundreds, thousands of temples. Hundreds of thousands of temples. I don't know. Lots of temples in India. Last I heard, there are only 4 Brahma temples in all of India. Might be more now. There's not very many, only 4. Not a popular guy. Not a popular guy. Everybody knows about Brahma, but he's not popularly worshipped. And there may be a reason for this. Brahma originally has 5 heads. 5 heads. Brahma comes into existence, and depending on the story, there's a couple of variations of this, but I'll give you one of them. He comes into existence, and in various ways, shapes, or forms, produces a daughter. And one of the versions, I believe, his wife is like, like the Earth Mother, like Earth. And they produce a daughter, and Brahma falls in love with his own daughter. He desires his own daughter. And he chases her all around the world, and I guess everywhere he chases her, different sort of things, different beings, animals and plants spring up. But eventually, he catches her, catches his own daughter, and I don't know whether he seduces her or he forces himself on her, depending on which version you read. He has sex with his own daughter. He commits incest with his own daughter. And in other stories, what happens is he marries his daughter. And from this incestuous liaison, this is where human beings come from. This is one story about the origin of humans. Not the only one in Hinduism, but one of them. Human beings come from this. And a couple things happen. First of all, pretty much like today, incest is frowned upon and is illegal in India as it is elsewhere. And the other gods are really pissed off at Brahma for this. They're like, well, what do you mean sex with your own daughter? That's not cool. We have to punish you in some way. So they get Shiva. Shiva goes to Brahma, and as punishment, hacks off one of the heads. This is why Brahma only has 4 heads. Okay. The other part of the story is interesting, and this is also supposedly this is why Brahma is not popular with people, because we don't worship the incest god who screws his own daughter. Yeah. Forget it. Don't worship him. But if you look at the story symbolically, it has a very interesting symbolic meaning. And the symbolic meaning is that Brahma is sort of the pure spirit. And the daughter, the spirit and matter, earth, are related. They're very closely related. And when they join together, with sex being the symbolism of this, when they join together and produce offspring, which are human beings, that we, even though we are of matter, we are born of matter, we possess the divine spirit. We get that from our father, Brahma. We get the divine spirit from him. So that divine spirit then comes down into human beings, and human beings, being the product of this relationship, possess not only matter, we not only come from matter, but we also possess this spirit of the divine spark, which comes from Brahma. Okay? So this is symbolic meaning of the story. Symbolic meaning. Now, can we talk about Freud here too? Can we talk about Freud here too? This is another story of incest, right? So all these people, come up with these stories of incest, the ancient Greeks and the Hindus, this incest thing is really a big theme when we start talking about people. Okay? But again, you can see this as an Oedipal complex. I mean, they used to say back in the old days, they called this an Electra complex, because Electra was the incestuous story of the woman and her father in Greek myths. But most Freudians just call this an Oedipal complex. We just shorten it. But this can also be a sort of Oedipal complex. So human beings are the result of this sort of incestuous relationship, and this sort of obviously would inform our psychology, if you will, right? Form our psychology. So this is Brahma. Now, you see him here. He's holding the Vedas. He's holding the sacred scriptures, and he's giving this hand sign. We're going to talk about the hand signs a little bit later when we get to Buddhism. A number of these hand signs in Hinduism, and they also go over into Buddhism. These are called mudras. And sometimes we have mudras associated with certain gods and goddesses. Sometimes the gods and goddesses can do many different mudras depending on what's going on with them. But here we have this mudra, and this is the one that you guys know this one, because we do this too as human beings, right? Somebody comes up to you, they're really upset. You're in the office, the boss yelled at you, your boss yelled at you, come up to me, oh, I'm so pissed off, and what do? I go, hey, it's okay, it's going to be cool. Right? That's this mudra. we'll talk about this. So he's here, he's saying, hey, it's going to be cool. All right. I mentioned to you this whole thing about Brahma, creating the world. And here you go. This is a translation from the Sanskrit. You can read this. I'm going to try to read it in Sanskrit. Yasa Yambasi, Saya Nasaya, Yoga Nidram, Vikavata, Nabri, Hara. I can't pronounce the rest of it. The translation: a part of the Purusa lies down within the water of the universe. From the navel of his body sprouts a lotus stem, and from the lotus flower atop the stem, Brahma, master of all engineers in the universe, becomes manifest. This is a literal translation. And this is the depiction of this here. You can't see it too well, but this is Vishnu, and here is from his navel. Coming up is Brahma, bringing the universe into existence. Okay. Well, I have these out of order. I really should talk about. I don't want to talk about Shiva next. Okay. Slide thing. I don't know. They did something to this computer and they just whacked it out. I wanted to talk. I'll talk about the goddesses. I want to talk about Sarasvati at some point. This is Brahma's consort. Okay. We'll go through this later. Oh, we're almost out of time. Okay, I tell you what. I think I'm going to call it a day today because I don't want to get into this at the last minute. A lot more stuff. So next time. So again, next week we are not meeting in class. We're meeting at the temple. For those of you who are going, show up there. Please bring your paper if you're showing up. We'll spend an hour or so there, roughly 45 minutes, an hour, and then they'll turn you on your own. And we will reconvene here the week after. I will finish up with Hinduism, and we'll be good to go. Be there about 9-ish, 9:15-ish. We'll start walking around about 9:30. Okay. If you come late, that's fine. Just wander around until you find us. Okay. Don't not show up because you're running late.
I heard.
Yeah, bring your paper with you, please. If you gave me one, you're fine. You're fine.
I heard from. I don't remember. There's a reason that